It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in a quiet neighborhood. Birds were singing, flowers were blooming, and the warm wind carried the sound of soft music through the streets. Across the road, at a small but beautiful garden, people were gathering. They were laughing, dancing, and setting up tables with colorful food and decorations. It was a wedding day, a special day for David and Amina. Everyone was smiling, children were running around, older guests were chatting, and the bride was glowing in her white dress. Her groom, David, stood proudly beside her, helping guests and giving hugs. His suit was simple, but his smile was full of love. But not everyone was happy. Just a few steps away, behind thick curtains and glass windows, sat Mrs. Margaret Parker. She lived alone in the large gray house across the street. Her sharp eyes watched the wedding guests closely. Her lips were tight and her fingers tapped on the wooden table in front of her. She didn't like what she saw. They're too loud, she whispered to herself. Too many of them, disturbing the peace. But deep down, it wasn't just the music or the crowd that bothered her. It was something else, something darker. Most of the guests were people of color, and Margaret Parker didn't like that. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? There's a large group outside my house. Loud music? Too many people? I think there might be some trouble. Her voice was cold and flat. Ma'am, is anyone fighting? Is there violence? No, but they don't belong here, she said sharply. This is a quiet neighborhood. We'll send an officer to check. The voice on the phone replied. 10 minutes later, a police car arrived. The music stopped. The guests turned to look, confused. David stepped forward, calm, but alert. Mrs. Parker stood at her window, watching like a hawk. She sipped her tea with a small, satisfied smile. The officer, a young man named Officer Hughes, got out of the car and walked over. David greeted him politely. Good afternoon, officer. Can I help you? We received a noise complaint, Hughes replied. Just checking in. David nodded. Of course. We have a permit for the event. Would you like to see it? He reached into his coat pocket and handed over a folded paper. The officer read it, then looked around. No fights, no screaming, just soft music, food, and people enjoying a wedding. Officer Hughes gave a small smile. Looks like everything's in order. But before he turned to leave, Amina stepped forward. Her face was calm, but her eyes held pain. Officer, she said gently. Did someone call? Just because we look different? The officer hesitated. I can't say, ma'am. I just follow the calls. David looked toward the house across the street, toward the window where they all knew the caller was watching. Mrs. Parker stood still behind her curtain, holding her cup tight. Her heart was beating fast, but she didn't know why. The music started again, a little softer this time. The guests tried to smile and continue, but the moment had changed. The joy was still there, but a shadow had passed through it. David walked back to his friends, but his mind was racing. This wasn't the first time he had felt judged, but today was supposed to be different. Today was his wedding day. At Amina, and she took his hand. We won't let her ruin this, she said softly. But deep inside, something had shifted. That night, long after the last guest left and the lights were turned off, Mrs. Parker sat alone in her kitchen. She replayed the day in her head. The music, the laughter, the smiling faces. Her phone sat on the table beside her. Her teacup was empty. Why had she really called the police? She told herself it was the noise, the parking, the crowd. But she knew the truth. Her late husband Richard had always said, "Be kind, Margaret. You never know someone's story." She never listened. The next morning a knock came at her door. She opened it and froze. It was David. He wasn't angry. He looked tired, but calm. I just wanted to say, he began. We forgive you, but we hope you think about what you did. Before she could reply, he placed a small box in her hands and walked away. Inside the box was a slice of wedding cake and a note. Everyone deserves love, even those who've forgotten how to give it. Mrs. Parker sat back down in her chair. She stared at the cake. Her hands were shaking. She had made a mistake, and something told her this wasn't the end. David closed the door quietly behind him as he left Mrs. Parker's porch. The morning sun was bright, but something in his heart still felt heavy. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he walked slowly down the street, thinking about the past. The pain, the memories, the long road that brought him here. To this life, this love, this moment. A childhood marked by silence. David grew up in a small town not far from here. His mother, Angela, raised him alone after his father passed away in a car accident when David was only 6. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Angela worked 2 jobs, one as a cleaner in a hotel, the other at a diner every day. She came home tired, but she always smiled at David. You're going to do great things, she would say, wiping sweat from her forehead. You just have to keep your head high. David always nodded, but school was hard. School where he wasn't welcome. David was the only black child in his grade. Most of the other kids didn't talk to him. Some ignored him. A few bullied him. They called him names. They laughed at his clothes. One day, a boy threw his lunchbox in the trash and said, "People like you don't belong here." David didn't fight back. He never cried in front of them. But at night, under his blanket, he cried quietly into his pillow. His mother saw the pain. She wanted to protect him, but she knew the world wasn't always kind. So she taught him strength. Don't give them your heart, she said. Save it for the people who deserve it. A teenager with big dreams in high school, David kept to himself. He studied hard. He worked part-time at a grocery store after school. He didn't have many friends, but he had big dreams. He wanted to become a lawyer, not for money, not for fame, but because he wanted to fight for people like his mother, people who were overlooked, mistreated, judged by their skin and not their soul. But every dream came with a test. The day that almost broke him. One winter evening, when David was 17, he was walking home from the library. A police car pulled up beside him. 2 officers stepped out. One of them pointed a flashlight in David's eyes. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked. "Just walking home," David said softly. "This isn't your neighborhood. I live 5 blocks away." They didn't believe him. They searched his backpack. They made him sit on the ground. People walked by and stared. David didn't cry. He didn't argue. He sat there for 40 minutes until they let him go. When he got home, he didn't speak. He went straight to his room and closed the door. That night, something inside him hardened, but it didn't turn into hate. It turned into purpose. Becoming a man of strength. Years passed. David worked hard. He won a scholarship, finished law school, and started helping young people who faced unfair treatment. He became known for his calm voice and kind heart. He never raised his voice, but his words carried power. He met Amina at a youth event. She was helping refugee families find jobs. They fell in love slowly, quietly, like a song building verse by verse. She understood his silence. He understood her fire. Together they built something beautiful. Back to the present now. On the morning after their wedding, David stood at the small community park where he and Amina had first met. He sat on a bench and looked at the trees swaying gently in the wind. He thought about how far he had come. He thought about Mrs. Parker, her face full of fear, her voice full of hate. He didn't hate her back, but he did wonder how many others thought like her. How many people still judged a man not by his heart but by the color of his skin. He reached into his pocket and took out a folded photo, a picture of him and his mother, taken at his law school graduation. She was crying in the picture, but her smile was proud. Angela's voice in his mind. Evan now. He could hear her voice. Never let their hate become your hate. That's why he went to Mrs. Parker's door. Not to fight, not to argue, but to remind her of something she had forgotten, that love was stronger than hate. Meanwhile, inside the house, across the street, Mrs. Parker sat in her chair, the slice of wedding cake still untouched beside her. She had read David's note 4 times. Everyone deserves love, even those who've forgotten how to give it. No one had ever said that to her before. She thought about her late husband, Richard. He had once told her about a soldier in the war, a black soldier who had saved his life when he was shot near the border. He carried me on his back for miles. Richard had said, color didn't matter, only courage. She never asked more about it. She didn't want to hear. Now, she wished she had listened. The house was quiet, too quiet. Mrs. Parker sat in her armchair with the wedding cake still sitting on a plate, untouched, starting to dry. The room smelled faintly of old wood and cold tea. Her eyes were fixed on the letter in her hand, the one from her late husband, Richard. She had read it 3 times. Don't ever let fear or hate blind you. Promise me, Alice. His words echoed in her ears like a whisper from the past. Her heart beat faster. She stood up slowly and walked toward the attic ladder. She hadn't gone up there in years. Dusk hung in the air like forgotten memories. But something inside her pushed her forward. The box of forgotten years. She opened the old wooden chest labeled War Richard's Letters. Inside, she found more yellowed pages, some medals, and a faded photograph. She held the photo close to her eyes. 2 soldiers stood together. One was clearly her husband, tall, proud, smiling. The other was a young black man, also in uniform. His arm over Richard's shoulder. On the back of the photo, in Richard's handwriting, were 4 words. Henry Jones, my brother forever. Mrs. Parker sat down slowly. Her hands shook. Henry Jones. The name felt familiar. Too familiar. She searched through the letters again and found another envelope with Henry's name on it. It wasn't from Richard. It was from a woman named Angela Jones, Henry's wife. Dear Mrs. Parker, I hope you received this letter. My husband Henry always spoke about your Richard. He saved my Henry's life once. Henry never forgot it, and neither did we. Our son David was born the year after the war ended. I just thought you should know. Part of your husband's story lives in our son. The letter slipped from Mrs. Parker's hand. She stared at the wall, silent. David, the groom, the man who had just married, across the street. The same man she had judged, the same man she had called the police on. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the son of the man who saved her husband's life. The weight of the past tears welled in her eyes, not the angry kind, the ashamed kind. She had always told herself she was just old-fashioned, that she liked peace and quiet, that she wasn't racist, just careful. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She had turned cold. Somewhere between Richard's death and her own loneliness, she had built a wall around her heart, a wall made of fear and pride. And now, the truth broke it open. She had hurt the son of the very man who gave her husband another chance at life, a glimpse into her pet. Parker was not always like this. She used to smile. She used to bake cookies for the neighbors. But after Richard passed away, she shut the world out. She stopped going to church, stopped calling friends, stopped believing people could be kind, and the neighborhood changed too. New faces, new families, different languages, different clothes. She felt left behind, and instead of learning, instead of opening her heart, she became bitter. The old store memory then. Another memory returned. Many years ago, she had owned a small gift shop. One day, a teenage boy had come in, looking nervous. His clothes were worn, his hands sweaty. He looked at a card on the shelf, a birthday card with flowers on it. She had watched him closely. "What do you want?" she had asked sharply. He looked up and said, "Just this card. It's for my mom." She didn't smile. She didn't help him. Instead, she said, "People like you can't afford things in here." He had left quietly now, sitting in her attic. She realized something. That boy was David. The guilt that wouldn't go away. Parker buried her face in her hands. How many chances had she wasted? How many people had she pushed away? And now, the very man she once judged had shown her kindness. He didn't yell. He didn't curse her. He just asked, "Why?" And now she knew the answer, not because he was weak, but because he was strong. Meanwhile, across the street, David was telling Amina about the letter. "She called the police," he said, "but it's deeper than that. She looked at us like we were trash. And yet, something in her eyes told me she wasn't always that way." Amina nodded. "Hurt people hurt others." David smiled softly. "She has something to face, and I think she's starting to." Mrs. Parker makes a choice that night. Mrs. Parker stayed up late. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear David and Amina," she paused, then continued. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want to tell you the truth. Your father, Henry, saved my Richard's life, and I failed to honor that. I hurt you. I judged you. I was wrong. But if you'll allow me, I want to say this in person." She folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow, she would walk across the street, not with hate, but with humility. The sun was just beginning to rise. A quiet breeze moved through the neighborhood. Most people were still asleep, but Mrs. Parker was wide awake. She held the envelope tightly in her hand, the one she had written the night before. Her heart beat fast as she walked slowly toward the house across the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. She wasn't sure what would happen. Would they open the door? Would they even want to see her? But she knew one thing. She had to try. An unexpected crowd. As she reached the front gate, she stopped. There were people there. 4 of the wedding guests, young, angry, serious faces. One of them, a woman in a red dress, was holding something in her hand. Mrs. Parker froze. It was the letter. Her letter. The woman stepped forward. "We saw this in the mailbox," she said sharply. "You want to say sorry now?" Mrs. Parker opened her mouth, but no words came. "I remember you," the woman said. 10 years ago, I came to your shop. I was 12. I tried to buy a gift for my mother. You told me, 'We don't want your kind in here.' Do you remember that?" Mrs. Parker blinked. She truly didn't remember, but the girl did, and that made it real. David steps out just then. The front door opened. David walked out, calm, as always. He looked at the group, then at Mrs. Parker. The woman in the red dress handed him the letter. David read the first few lines silently. Then, he looked at Mrs. Parker. He didn't speak for a long moment. Finally he said, "Come inside." The group looked shocked. "What? You're letting her in?" David nodded. "Yes, just me and her. Please give us a minute." They didn't like it, but they respected his choice. Mrs. Parker followed him through the door, her hands still shaking. A conversation, long overdue. They sat at the small wooden table near the kitchen, the same table where David and Amina had shared their wedding dinner just 2 nights ago. "I didn't expect you to read it," she said softly. "I did," David replied, "but I didn't expect rest." She looked up. "You mean Henry?" David nodded. "I never met him. He died before I was born, but I grew up hearing stories about him. My mom said he saved someone in the war. She never knew who. Now I do." Mrs. Parker's eyes filled with tears. "He saved my husband. Richard, I never told anyone that he was a black soldier. I thought people wouldn't understand, or maybe I didn't want to face it myself." David listened, saying nothing. She continued, "And then I saw you, happy, surrounded by love. And I felt something I didn't understand. It wasn't just hate. It was fear, of change, of being forgotten, of losing the world I used to know." David finally spoke. "The world has changed, but love hasn't. You saw our wedding and felt fear. I saw your letter and felt hope." She looked away. "I don't deserve hope," David said gently. "Maybe not, but you're trying. That matters." The attic memory. He looked at her closely. "Why now? What made you write it?" She smiled sadly. "An attic, a photo, and a letter from Richard." She told him everything about the box, the photo of his father, the letter Richard wrote after the war. She even handed him the photograph. David held it in his hands carefully, his eyes focused on the young man beside Richard, his father, full of life. His voice cracked. "That's him. That's really him." Mrs. Parker wiped her eyes. "He carried my husband through a battlefield. I can't even carry my pride down the street. Meanwhile, outside the guests still stood outside, talking among themselves. She doesn't deserve his kindness, someone said. She's only sorry because she got caught, another added, but Amina stood silently watching the door. She wasn't sure either, but something told her David was doing the right thing, and sometimes, the right thing isn't the easy thing. Back inside, David handed the photo back. Would you allow me to keep a copy? Mrs. Parker nodded quickly. Of course I'll make one today. He looked at her. You've taken a step forward. That doesn't erase what's behind. But it's a start, she whispered. Thank you. Just then, Amina entered quietly. David smiled. This is Amina, my wife. Mrs. Parker stood. You looked beautiful at your wedding. I'm sorry I ruined part of it. Amina paused. Her voice was calm. You didn't ruin anything. You only showed us how much more work the world still needs. Mrs. Parker nodded. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. The invitation. Amina looked at David. Dada said, we're having a small community dinner on Friday. Would you come? Mrs. Parker's eyes widened. Amina smiled. Yes, you can sit at our table, and you don't need to say anything. Just listen. Mrs. Parker took a deep breath. I will come, she said, and I will listen. Friday evening came quickly. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink. Children ran up and down the street, laughter echoing through the air. Warm smells of food drifted from every corner. Baked chicken, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. David and Amina stood outside their house, greeting neighbors with smiles and hugs. They had turned their backyard into a peaceful dinner space. White fairy lights hung across wooden poles. Small round tables were set with candles and plates. Everyone was welcome. It didn't matter what language they spoke or what skin color they had. Everyone, including Mrs. Parker. The arrival at exactly 6:45 p.m., Mrs. Parker stood outside the gate. She wore a plain blue dress and held a small plate of cookies in her hands. Her heart thudded in her chest. She hadn't gone to a social event in years, not since Richard's funeral, not since she started living behind her curtains. And tonight, she was walking into a crowd of people, most of whom knew what she had done. She breathed in slowly and stepped forward. First reactions, whispers started immediately. That's her. She actually came. Why did David invite her? Some people looked away, others stared. A few smiled politely. David walked over and greeted her with warmth. I'm glad you came, he said. Mrs. Parker gave a small smile and held out the cookies. Thank you for inviting me. I didn't expect you would. David took the plate gently. Sometimes, change begins with a seat at the table. Amina joined them and nodded. Come, we saved you a seat near us. Tension at the table. Mrs. Parker sat down quietly. She didn't speak much. She listened to the stories being shared about work, school, family, but one voice stood out. It was Monica, the woman in the red dress who had confronted her days ago. She hadn't sat near Mrs. Parker. She was 2 tables away, but her eyes never left her. Every time Mrs. Parker tried to smile, Monica looked away sharply. The air grew heavier. Finally, after dessert was served, Monica stood up. I need to say something, she said. The music stopped. All eyes turned to her. The confrontation. Monica held a small notebook in her hands. When I was 12, she began, I went into a gift shop. It was owned by a woman with red lipstick and cold eyes. I wanted to buy a card for my mom. I had $3. She looked at me like I didn't belong. She paused, looking directly at Mrs. Parker, and she said, people like you don't belong here. Murmurs filled the air. David stood. Monica, she raised her hand. Let me finish. She turned back to the crowd. I never forgot that moment. I went home crying. I tore the card in half. My mom never knew why I didn't give it to her. Tears filled her eyes. But the woman who said that is here. Tonight, at our table, she brought cookies and wore her nicest dress, but I remember what she made me feel. The silence was deep. Even the children stopped laughing. Mrs. Parker's responsible eyes turned to Mrs. Parker. She stood up slowly. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. I remember the shop, she said, but I don't remember your face, Monica. And that makes it worse, because I said things to people I didn't even see. I was bitter. I was afraid of change. And I used that fear to hurt people. I can't undo the words I said. But I want to say this. She looked directly at Monica. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. No one does. Monica stared at her. The hurt still sat in her eyes like a shadow that refused to leave. An elder steps in then. From the back, an older woman stood up. She was quiet most of the evening. Her name was Mama Ruth, known in the neighborhood as a wise elder with a kind heart. She walked to the center and raised her hand. Let me speak, she said softly. Forgiveness is not forgetting, she continued. It's choosing peace over pain. We all carry hurt, but if we carry it too long, it becomes our prison. She looked at Mrs. Parker, then at Monica. Both of you are brave, one for speaking her pain, the other for facing it. Then she smiled gently. Tonight, we decide what kind of street we want to live on, one of judgment or one of healing. The hug. Monica looked down. Then slowly, she walked toward Mrs. Parker. The tension in the air tightened. Mrs. Parker held her breath. Would Monica yell, walk past her, say nothing? But instead, Monica stopped in front of her, and then she hugged her. Tightly. People clapped. Some cried. Even David looked surprised. Monica whispered in her ear, "I'm still hurt, but I don't want to stay there forever." Mrs. Parker nodded. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." The end of the night as the dinner ended, people stayed longer than planned. They laughed, danced, shared food, and even asked Mrs. Parker for her cookie recipe. She smiled, not from pride, but from relief. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own neighborhood. She felt human again. The dinner was over. The lights were coming down. People were saying their goodbyes. Laughter still floated in the air like a warm breeze. Mrs. Parker sat alone at the garden table, her empty teacup in front of her. The night had been emotional, painful, but healing. Monica's hug still stayed with her like a soft weight in her chest. She had made mistakes. But tonight, something shifted. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The fallen letter as she reached for her purse to leave. She noticed something was missing. A small paper was sticking out from under the table. She bent down slowly and pulled it out. It was a letter, yellowed, folded, and delicate. She looked at the handwriting. It was Richard's. Her hands froze. She didn't remember placing it in her purse. Maybe it had been inside one of the other envelopes. Maybe it got stuck. But now, it was in her hands. The final words of Richard Parker Shea opened it slowly. "My dearest Alice, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. There are things I never said, things I was too afraid to tell you. But now, I must." Her heart began to race. The war changed me. Not just the blood and the bombs. It was Henry, the man who carried me when I was too weak to walk. He didn't just save my life, he changed it. We talked for hours while hiding in trenches. He told me about his wife, Angela, about the child they hoped to have. I told him about you. We laughed. We cried. And when he was shot in the leg, I carried him back. Mrs. Parker gasped. She had always believed Henry saved Richard, but the truth was, they saved each other. After the war, Henry wrote to me once. He said his son David was born. I wanted to visit them, to meet the boy who came from the man who became my brother. But you were different then, Alice. You were afraid. I didn't push it. I wish I had. I saw the way you looked at people, sometimes, not with hate, but with fear. But fear turns into walls, and walls block love. If you're still afraid, Alice, it's not too late to tear those walls down. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter. Tears slid down her cheeks. She wiped them with the edge of her shawl. She had never truly known her husband, but now, even from the grave, he was teaching her how to love again. The quiet walk home, she left the dinner slowly. No one stopped her. Some smiled, some waved. Others nodded quietly, but one little girl ran after her. She was about 6 years old, wearing a yellow dress. She held a paper flower in her hand and said, "This is for you." Mrs. Parker bent down and took it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The child smiled and ran back to her mother. The attic. Again later that night, Mrs. Parker went back to the attic. She sat among the boxers and dust and old photos. She placed Richard's final letter in a new frame and set it on the small shelf beside his war medals. Then, she sat in silence, thinking, praying. Changing meanwhile. At David's house, David and Amina sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea. "She stayed the whole night," Amina said. She listened. David nodded. "She changed." Amina smiled softly. "But change doesn't mean people forget the past." David looked down. "I don't want people to forget. I just want them to grow." Then Amina said something unexpected. "Father would be proud of you." David froze. "My father?" he whispered. Amina nodded. "Yes, not because you forgave her, but because you stood in truth and still chose love." David stared at the candle on the table, a flame small but steady. The next morning, Mrs. Parker stood at her window, but this time, not behind the curtain, this time with the window wide open. She looked at the street alive, diverse, full of voices and color, and she smiled. Then she did something even more unexpected. Paintbrush and began repainting the old wooden bench outside her house. It had been untouched for years. As the sun rose, neighbors walked by, surprised to see her. Some waved, some said good morning. She waved back. One woman stopped and asked, "Need help with the bench?" Mrs. Parker smiled. "Only if you don't mind the mess." The woman laughed. "Honey, life is already messy." They laughed together. The sun was rising slowly over Maple Street. Birds chirped on the rooftops, and early walkers stretched their arms under the pink sky. But Mrs. Parker's heart was not calm. She stood in front of her house, paint-stained hands frozen at her sides. Across from her, just a few steps away, stood Angela, the mother of David, the wife of the man who saved Richard in the war. She hadn't said a word yet. Her eyes were full of history, full of questions. And Mrs. Parker suddenly felt like that scared little girl she had once been, full of shame, full of silence. A quiet beginning. Angela looked around, then finally spoke. "I was here once," she said softly. "Years ago. I walked past your house. You were watering your flowers. I waved." Mrs. Parker swallowed hard. "I don't remember." Angela nodded. "You didn't wave back." The words weren't loud, but they cut deep. Mrs. Parker looked down. "I didn't know who you were." Angela's eyes didn't blink. "But you knew what I was." The letter's legacy. Angela held something in her hand. It was the letter, the same one Richard wrote. David had shown it to her the night before. I read your husband's words, she said. They were beautiful, kind. He saw my Henry for the man he was. Mrs. Parker nodded. Richard loved him like a brother. Angela's voice broke slightly. Then why didn't you ever come visit? Not once. My son never knew who saved your husband's life. Why? Mrs. Parker's lips trembled. Because I was afraid of what people would say, of what I didn't understand. Angela looked at her for a long time, afraid of love. A decision is made. Mrs. Parker didn't answer, but she did something else. She stepped forward and said, Angela, I want to make it right. I can't go back in time, but I can speak now. Angela narrowed her eyes. Speak where? Mrs. Parker looked across the street at David and Amina's house. To everyone. Later that day, the invitation that evening, David received a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Parker. She held a small card in her hand. It read, Community Gathering, Saturday evening, at the park. A message from Alice Parker. She said, I want to say something, not in secret, not quietly, but in front of the people I hurt. David paused. You're sure? She nodded. I'm old but not too old to tell the truth. Saturday evening, the park was full. Families gathered on picnic blankets. Children played near the swings. Some elders sat quietly in folding chairs, but all of them were waiting. Mrs. Parker stood near a wooden stage. Her hands shook as she held the microphone. David stood nearby. Angela sat in the front row. Monica was next to her. Amina smiled softly. From behind the crowd, everyone was watching. The speech. Mrs. Parker looked at the people. So many faces. So many stories. So many memories. She took a deep breath. Some of you know me as the woman who called the police during a wedding. Others know me as the woman who owned the little gift shop on 3rd Street. Maybe some of you remember me by the words I said, or the way I looked away when I should have looked closer. She paused. The crowd was silent. I'm here because I've lived a long life, but not always a good one. I've said things I can't take back. I've judged people I didn't know. I let fear guide me. Fear of what was new. Fear of change. Fear of love I didn't understand. She looked at Angela. I was too proud to thank the man who saved my husband. Too afraid to visit the family that gave me a second chance. Her eyes began to tear. But I read a letter my husband wrote before he died. In it, he reminded me of something I forgot, that love is stronger than fear, that people are not their color, they're their kindness, their courage, their heart. Then she looked at the crowd. I'm not asking for forgiveness today, I'm offering the truth, and I'm asking for the chance to do better, for whatever time I have left. The crowd remained still. Then, someone clapped. Then another. And then the whole park began to applaud. Angela stood up. She walked to the stage. People held their breath. Then she climbed up beside Mrs. Parker and held her hand. She leaned in and whispered, loud enough for all to hear, Henry would be proud of you today. Mrs. Parker's knees gave way, but Angela held her. It wasn't just a hug, it was a moment, a healing, a circle finally complete. Later that night, David, Amina, and Angela sat together with Mrs. Parker in the backyard. They shared tea and laughter. Mrs. Parker looked around at the lights, the music, and the people who now sat beside her, and she said quietly, I never thought I'd be part of something again. David smiled. You were always a part of it. You just had to open your door. The next morning, the flyer still sat on David's table. It was official. Notice Maple Park will be closed and cleared in 30 days for commercial development. All events must be canceled. City Planning Office. David stared at it in silence. This wasn't just a park. This was where children laughed, where families picnicked, where forgiveness happened. Just days ago, where Mrs. Parker gave her public apology, and a community chose love over hate. Now, it was at risk. In this time, no one was staying silent. A knock on the door that afternoon. Someone knocked on Mrs. Parker's door. She opened it to find David, and Angela standing there. David held the flyer. We want to fight this, he said. Mrs. Parker didn't hesitate. I'm in. A plan begins. The next few days were a blur of activity. Amina printed signs. David contacted local reporters. Angela spoke to neighborhood leaders. But the most surprising voice came from Mrs. Parker. She stood in front of City Hall with a handwritten speech and said, You took our silence for permission. But this park saved my soul, and I won't let you bury it under concrete. Photos of her speech spread online. People were shocked. The same woman, who once hid behind curtains, now stood at the front of protest lines. The petition grows. Neighbors from all races and backgrounds came forward. A Muslim shopkeeper brought food to volunteers. A Latino family translated flyers into Spanish. Teenagers made TikToks sharing Mrs. Parker's transformation. Even Monica, the woman she once hurt, stood beside her holding a sign that said, People can change, but some places shouldn't. Within 5 days their petition reached 12,000 signatures. Local news showed up. Reporters asked Mrs. Parker, Why is this park so important to you? She replied, Because it gave me back something I thought I lost. A family.